Now we're going to explore some of the components of protected area management effectiveness. So the first component we're going to talk about is understanding the socioeconomic and ecological context within and around the protected area, which means that we have some baseline information about the health of the resources and an understanding of the local community and how they use or depend on the area or what their perceptions of the resource health is. So having this information helps managers to understand the changes to those social or ecological conditions over time. And if you're moving the needle on, improving those conditions. So for example, are target fish species improving, or do community members feel they're benefiting from the site, or do they support management? And knowing this information can also help you design appropriate management actions. So for example, if most community members rely on the resources for the primary source of income or food source, then placing a whole area as no fishing area, no take area is likely not going to be feasible. Or if people don't perceive the resources are declining, but your ecological assessments show that they are, you might have to conduct some outreach to share some of that information and maybe help people see, what your information is showing, what your data is showing, and then compare that to what they see and try and come to an understanding of what's happening with the resources. So assessing and reviewing this information during management plan updates is really critical to understand how things have changed over time, if you're moving toward your objectives, and what management actions you might need to take. So this example on the slide is from Nimbal and Yap, which you're going to hear more about in a little while. But when they updated their management plan, they reviewed their biological and their socioeconomic data to identify where they were doing really well and where they were challenged. So this is one of the first things that they did, is say, okay, let's look at our objectives. Let's see where we're doing well. And things that they found out through their socioeconomic data were things like 100% of households are aware and supportive of the no fishing and harvesting in the no take zones. So that's great. They know their support for the area. They also agree that the MCA will help secure food for future generations. So they found that there was really strong support in the community for the site. The biological monitoring, some successes were that the fish biomass had increased within the MCA. So that was great. And there's a whole other page that's underneath here, which is the challenges. But I wanted to show you one, which was that the biomass increases in the MCA were mostly due to a small number of species. So that populations of many of the important larger fish species had not increased according to the monitoring. And that's likely due to the small size of the MCA and the lack of management outside of the MCA for those bigger fish species. So looking at this socio-ecological context before they updated their management plan helped them see what's happening in the community. What do people support? Where are there some challenges with maybe community perceptions? And what does our biological data show us? On one hand, it's great, we're seeing biomass increase, but when we go a little deeper, and for this, they actually talked to some of the scientists that do the monitoring, they found, well, it's increasing, but it's a small number of species that are increasing. And if they want to see some of these bigger species increase, they're going to have to think about some other management strategies. So the socioecological information is often collected through field assessments like biological and household survey assessments. But if you don't have this scientific data, it doesn't mean you can't understand what's going on in these areas. It shouldn't limit you from thinking about this. And even if you have the limited financial resources or capacity to do these more formal assessments, you can get quality information through discussions with local stakeholders. And that can be going out and mapping the area, identifying, what the health of the resources are in different areas, what the trends are, what the threats are. And those community perceptions will take you a long way in understanding what's happening at the site and getting that kind of information. So I don't want you to feel that if you don't have these type of formal assessments, it means you can't, get a good understanding of what's going on. But it does mean that you need to take time and make the effort to collect that information periodically, especially during times when you're getting ready to update your management plan, to try to understand what the changes are over time. Are the trends moving upward and improving with the resources or declining? Are community members still supportive, or they haven't thought about the MPA since 2000, since we did the last management plan? So understanding those kind of things are really important. And just to touch on a few types of information that are important in this process are things like the habitat types, conditions and trends in those resources, threats to the resources, and from a socioeconomic perspective, who are the key stakeholders, how are they using it, or how do they depend on the site, what do they think the resource conditions are, and what do they support management of the site. So if you recall this image that we talked about earlier, we talked about how these ultimate objectives or desired results of protected areas are generally focused on those improvements to ecological or socioeconomic conditions that we had on the right-hand page. So this is the information that we're assessing when we're talking about understanding the socio-ecological systems. It's this ultimate objective of why we create the protected area and what are the trends in moving toward those objectives. These are some of the ways you can influence or improve your understanding of the socio-ecological context if this is a gap for your site. If no assessment has ever been complete or it hasn't been done in the last 3 to 4 years, one of the actions you might want to take even in your management plan update is to develop or redo assessments. That could be one of the actions you take. And that can include formal assessments like biological or SEM assessments or discussions with stakeholders. You also can ensure that your assessments and monitoring are clearly linked to the site objectives and helping you understand progress toward them. Make sure the assessments are helping you. If you're collecting data or someone's coming in to help you collect data, if that information isn't giving you helping you answer some of these questions, you might have to rethink how it's being done. And then finally, you can reach out to government and NGO partners who can help with assessing that information, especially for more formal assessments. So if you're trying to do a SEM assessment, maybe reaching out to like Micronesia Conservation Trust, who is coordinating the SEM assessments and getting support through that. So for example, you might want to know if your protected area has had impacts to local livelihoods, or if one of the objectives is to improve income or food resources to the local community. Or you might want to know if certain species that are important to stakeholders are improving, if that's one of your objectives. Many of you mentioned those type of things when you were talking about the clear objectives, or like improved health of coral reefs, or livelihoods, community benefits, or income generating. So those are the type of things that you can get through these type of assessments. Okay, so the next important component for effective management is who has the right to manage the site. So rights can lie within one group or across multiple groups in one site. And in some areas, one group has rights to make all the decisions and enforce all regulations. So this is the case in Yap, where communities' traditional rights to make decisions and enforce regulations about locally marine areas are protected by their constitution. In other cases, the main group carrying out the management of the site may not have a legal mandate or decision-making authority for certain critical actions that are needed to be effective. And that's oftentimes it's about enforcement of rules and regulations. So this is the case in Hawaii and Pohnpei, where communities are legally able to establish marine protected areas and make decisions about, what kind of rules there are, but they can't legally enforce those regulations because the marine environment is under the authority of the state to enforce. So communities in these places need to work with the relevant enforcement agencies to be effective in their enforcement programs. And in these cases, communities often establish things like collaborative enforcement agreements with those state authorities. And those agreements clarify what the roles and protocols are for addressing violations. So communities can often monitor and report violations, but they require state enforcement officers to come in and make citations or arrests. So that's an example where you have, you can rights to manage certain things, but other activities are reliant on other agencies. Similarly, you can have multiple authorities that can enforce different regulations in one site, which can make things complex as well. And this is the case in the past in Palau, where communities could enforce their local protected area rules, but they could not enforce national fisheries regulations in their waters because they were only enforceable by national law authorities. So even if a community conservation officer was out and saw someone violating a national law, like taking a fish or a banned fish like humphead parrotfish, they couldn't enforce it because they weren't a national law enforcement agent. So I believe this has been addressed by deputizing local conservation officers to enforce national laws in Palau, and that was a way that they figured out how to overcome this challenge, was deputizing those officers. But understanding who has the rights and mandates to manage these different activities is going to help you identify where your management might have limits and where you might need to collaborate with other groups who have management authority that are critical for certain actions of your site. So these are some of the ways you can improve rights to manage if your community doesn't have full rights to carry out decision-making or critical activities like enforcement. So while this is a long process, it is possible to change laws, policies, and legal mandates. In Hawaii, communities for a long time were not legally able to establish protected areas and decide on rules for their site. But through years and years of organization and collaboration between communities, and those communities collectively working with policymakers and NGOs, they were able to change the law to now allow for community-based fishery management areas, which gives the community legal right to establish a site and say what's allowed or not. They still can't enforce it, but they can establish a site. Alternatively, you can collaborate or create agreements with rights holders, and those can define the roles and responsibilities and ensure that those critical activities are addressed. And that's like what happened in Pohnpei and Palau and Hawaii, where communities collaborate with those enforcement agencies and develop agreements so that everyone is clear about who's allowed to do what and how it should happen. You know, how should a community report a violation? And we will hear more about these in future modules. The next key component for effective management is political will and support. And this is basically the level of support for protected areas from governance systems, both traditional governance systems and modern governance systems. Political will and support for protected areas can influence a lot. It can influence budgets, staffing, policies, and legal authorities, like we just talked about. And it's also something that's really challenging for managers to influence. So even though it's challenging to influence, understanding what's going on in the political landscape can really help you identify where there are barriers or potential opportunities to gain further support. For example, if there's little support by a government administration for protected areas that are largely dependent on government funding, it's good to start exploring other types of funding, whether it's through grants or other ways, if you know that a government administration is not supportive of protected areas. It may also be important to explore ways to influence political support through communications or innovative approaches that increase the likelihood of gaining further support. So you can communicate how protected areas support government priorities. We talked about regional and global commitments that your governments have made, and your protected areas are helping them to achieve those commitments. So making sure to communicate those and kind of show that you're helping them achieve their commitments can help you gain support. You're basically making them look good by saying like, hey, we're doing this great work. It's helping you achieve these global commitments. That makes their job easier because you're helping them achieve those goals. Additionally, demonstrating that the general public strongly supports protected areas can influence policymakers because they want to keep their voters happy. And this is similar to the case in Hawaii that I mentioned. It took a long time, but those communities working together and showing that there were so many communities that were interested in establishing locally managed areas, it was through that collective influence that helped push the needle so that they created a new law that enabled communities to establish protected areas. And political will and support can change over time as administrations change or political pressures sway opinions. So keeping an eye out for political leaders that are supportive of protected area efforts can provide really good opportunities to make changes. We know that there are some administrations that are more favorable to environmental causes. So putting an extra emphasis on regular communications during those times can help you maybe make changes that are lasting, like passing laws. So we know also that there are promising commitments made by political leaders in Micronesia that provide support for protected areas overall, like the Micronesia Challenge we talked about earlier. The Micronesia Challenge has basically continued over 20 political transitions. So you guys have really good foundation for political support in the region, also through your protected area network legislation in FSM, Palau, and Marshall Islands. But those took a while, like different states and different countries passed them at different times because you had to wait till a favorable political administration came into play. So while it's challenging, there are some ways you can improve political will and support. First, maintaining strong communications with policymakers. Some protected areas have invited policymakers to go out monitoring at the site and help them understand what's happening, especially when good things are happening. Sharing and showing progress can help get politicians excited and showing them how you're helping to achieve those national objectives. So is there a way that you can get political leaders engaged at your site? Working with other communities to raise your voice. The example I just gave of those communities getting together, it really does elevate an interest and make a difference when you have a collective voice going to policymakers. So things like the, a lot of you guys have these networks in your islands where you're bringing protected areas together and using those groups to elevate the voices of an interest of protected areas is really important. And then just exploring alternative options for support for things like funding. So looking at grant opportunities or NGO partners where you might not get the government support. And the final component for effective management that we're going to talk about today is what's called nested governance. So all protected areas lie within a broader framework of management that occurs outside its boundaries. For example, you can see in this image that marine protected areas lie within and can be impacted by management of watersheds or adjacent lands, municipal plans, or state or national policies like fisheries policies. So understanding these broader policies and management frameworks will help you identify where these activities may be needed to help you achieve your objectives, or they might help you address some external threats, or where they can do complementary activities and where you can support those broader management objectives. So we'll look at some examples of this. So for example, dirt being washed into a marine protected area from erosion of cleared land that's adjacent to the site can smother mangroves, seagrasses, and corals, which provide habitat for fish. So this could make it impossible for these protected areas to improve fish populations. The marine protected area alone is not going to be able to address the erosion issue. But working with watershed or upland forest management actions that help plant vegetation and reduce erosion can help you then achieve your marine protected area objectives. So understanding who owns that land, who manages that land, and how decisions are made would be critical for the success of a site like this. Here are some other examples of threats that could come from outside of a marine protected area and might require partnerships to address. You might have adjacent agriculture or development happening, clearing of lands for various purposes, septic system failures. All of these create pollution, sedimentation, and nutrients that can enter into the marine protected area. And while these activities taking place outside the boundaries of the protected area are often beyond the control of your management authority, they can be an obstacle or even prevent you from achieving your objective. So the main point about nested governance is that sometimes we think, well, this threat is out of our control, so we can't do anything about it. But that can completely undermine our efforts. And no matter what we do, we might not be successful if we don't try to address these. So it's really important to find ways of communicating and working with these relevant groups that can take management action and address these threats. So think about it as we move forward. What threats are coming from outside the site, and who is it that has management authority of those areas? And it's not just outside management that can influence your protected area. Your protected area can also influence and support outside management. So marine protected areas can play a key role in fisheries management through the protection of nursery habitat for target species like mangrove snapper in this image. Those fish larvae and juveniles and even adults can spill over into nearby areas and help improve fisheries outside of the protected area, which can support national fishery management objectives. So broader fishery management regulations can in turn help marine protected area objectives by establishing rules like national size limits of migratory species that move outside of the protected area. And this is often the case in Micronesia, where certain species that are important to communities, they move great distances. They move in and out of the protected area all the time. So things like certain groupers or emperors, they're going in and out of these smaller protected areas. So smaller protected areas alone can't build those populations because the fish move out. So island-wide or national policies that protect those fish when they're outside and enable them to have a chance to reproduce can really complement the protected areas that are protecting their habitat and them as juveniles. And the combination of these efforts are really effective at then improving these fish populations. But it's not something that protected areas can do alone. So these are some of the ways that you can make sure you're considering nested governance at your site. The first is to review the threats to your site from your management plan to identify if any are caused outside the site management and not being addressed. You can then identify and partner with external groups that can help take actions to address those threats and support your objectives. And we'll be doing a deeper look at threats in the next module. And you can also communicate how your protected areas help achieve broader management and policy efforts. So we discussed this in the political will session, but if your protected area is helping governments achieve international commitments or fisheries policies and fishery objectives at a national level, helping to showcase how your site is supporting those can help elevate support for protected areas. So the first component we're going to dive into is management planning. Management plans are critical for being effective because they really provide the foundation for everything you do at your site. They're documents that provide guidance to the site by identifying the purpose, the goals and objectives, or what you're trying to ultimately achieve. You identify your threats, your actions, and how you're going to monitor progress. So it's really laying that groundwork for everything that you do. And sometimes plans are mandated by law. For example, I think a lot of you, if your site's interested in being part of the protected area network, you are required to have a management plan. But in other cases, it's just a document that might be produced by a community to help manage their resources. So in either case, a good management plan is essential for effective management. So, even if it's legal tool, that's great. If it's just a community tool, that's great. In all cases, it's a really critical component. And plans are often perceived as they have to be these long documents and complicated, but they really don't need to be. And the best plans are the ones that are used and the ones that make it easy for managers to use. So plans can really look different for different sites, but even the simplest plans should be strategic. They should really clearly identify what the values are that are trying to be protected and managed. Like, what resources are you trying to protect and why are you trying to protect them? What are your objectives? What are you going to achieve and do to protect those resources? And how are you going to ultimately know if you're successful? So this is the example, again, I showed some of this in the last module from NIMPAL and YAP, where the group created simple one-pagers that focused on key different components of the management plan. And again, this is in your Google folder, so you can look at it more closely if it's something you think you're interested in kind of replicating. And it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but it was a way to make it more digestible for community members and managers to use regularly. I know that Berna even had these one-pagers made into like waterproof sheets so that they could really be used regularly and not have to worry about a piece of paper that's going to get disintegrated. So this might be a little bit of an inspiration of a more simple plan. And there's several reasons why a management plan is considered critical. They provide a lot of benefits. First, they improve management through strategic guidance. When you go through a planning process, you really go into understanding what's happening at the site, identifying threats, looking at what are those key actions that you need to take to be strategic in achieving your objectives, versus just kind of going out and, winging it, just doing whatever you think might work. It gives you that time to really think through things. They also help improve the use of financial staff and resources, because we are all limited in the resources that we have. There's no protected area out there that I've ever heard of that is not limited with their financial and human resources. So really understanding what your priorities are helps put any resources you have to the most needed activities. They can improve communication about management by clarifying what you're trying to do and why. So it helps the community understand this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it. And they can help increase accountability because you're going to document how are we going to measure our progress. So now we're going to look at the kind of information that can be included in a good management plan. Even though you have a developed plan already, the adaptive management process really allows you this time to look at that existing plan and make any adjustments so that you can improve any gaps. So the first couple of components of a good management plan are an introduction, which is really going to give you the overview. Why was this established? What is the legislative basis or authority for the plan's development? A brief history of how the plan was developed, and lessons learned from review periods, like what you're doing now. And what I want to show here, again, this is from the NIMPAL example, is that capturing and sharing progress on what's been done and what challenges remain can be a really powerful tool, because people don't always know in the community or, outside the community organizations you work with, they don't know all the things that are happening. And you guys in your homework have shown like you've done a lot of great activities already in these sites, but not everyone knows that. It kind of, things happen over time. So when you're able to pull all that information together and show this is what's already been done, and this is what we can celebrate, this is what we've been successful at, and then also show this is where we still have gaps or where we have challenges, it's a really nice way to communicate what's happening at the site. And I think it can really be appreciated by stakeholders. The second component here is the site description, and that's exactly what it sounds like: size, legal status, authority, roles and responsibilities, key ecological or social features, stakeholder groups, all of that kind of background information that you just need to capture somewhere. And it's helpful to have that captured for grants that you write or assessments that you do, things like that. So both of these sections include information that you captured in these past two homework sessions. And you'll continue to collect information that can support these. The next three sections that are important in a good plan are really the meat of the plan, meaning that these sections really provide you the guidance to management of the site. And we're going to go a lot deeper into each of these in this module, but just briefly here, this includes a threat assessment or a conceptual model, which gets into identifying what are the threats to the site and what are the root causes of those threats. Goals, smart objectives, and actions. And this is a critical component of management plan. It's really getting at what the community ultimately wants to achieve with the protected area, like improved fish populations or community benefits, and then how you're going to achieve it in the next few years. What are you going to do specifically, and what are you going to achieve toward those goals? And everything you do in your management really should be helping to achieve those goals and objectives. So that's why we really, push that this is the meat of what you're trying to do. And this is your guidance. This is your light that's shining. Like, this is what we should be following when we're thinking about decision making. And then zoning and rules. This is the design of the site, what's allowable, where, and who's allowed to do what. And maybe you have different zones or not, and we'll get more into that later in this module. The final three sections are additional components that provide details about how you're going to implement the plan. And they include a year one work plan or 1 year work plan and budget. So that's really, what are you going to do in the next year? Who's going to do it? And what does it cost? And this is where you can prioritize what you're going to do and really say, these are the most important actions for us to move toward achieving our goals and objectives. Monitoring and review periods describe how and when you're going to measure your progress and success toward your goals and objectives. So do you have formal monitoring set up, or like biological monitoring or socioeconomic monitoring? Are you going to use that, or is it going to be through community consultations? It also describes review periods when you're going to review how you're doing and make plan updates. So if you remember way back in module 1, the Helen Reef program, when Wayne Andrew was talking to us, he was saying that the Helen Reef program has these monthly check-ins to address any immediate needs. The staff meets with the board and they're just going through, how are things going? Are there any kind of critical things we need to address right away? So they do that monthly. And then annually, they have review periods where their core team goes on a bit of a retreat and they discuss how things are progressing, any changes they need to make, and kind of just does an annual assessment. And then finally, every 4 to 5 years, they do their big management plan update. This is that adaptive management cycle that comes full circle, where they really look at all of their biological and social data, and they assess how they're doing toward their objectives and make bigger adjustments toward their management actions. So in this section, you're really describing when you're going to do these different things. And it doesn't have to be super long, but you want to just be able to show, this is when we're going to review this to make sure we're on track. Otherwise, you kind of can lose momentum. And if there's no periods that you're kind of checking in and doing this, it's kind of easy to sort of like lose that interest. And especially if you're pulling in stakeholders during these, if nobody's hearing about it and they're not engaged, it's hard to keep that momentum up. And then other sections in the plan are optional, but they might be things like enforcement plans or ecotourism plans, or maybe you're considering climate change and you haven't before and you want to build that into your plan. So you can update your plan and include other sections. So in this module, we're going to review the bolded sections here in more detail. And this list and the description is in the Google folder, and it's what you'll use as guidance to update your management plan in module 5 and afterwards. Your plan does not have to follow this exact format, but, think about, is it important to cover this information? Because a lot of this is sort of core information that's useful to have in a plan. And remember, you're not starting from scratch. You likely have a lot of this information in an existing plan that just needs to be updated. So you can use that and then fill in the gaps. And we're going to actually look at that today in your teams. One other thing I want to say is that management plans do take time to be done well. They cannot be done quickly, unfortunately, because each of these sections requires thoughtful discussion, stakeholder engagement often, and then just writing of the plan. So it's not that plans have to be long and complex, but if you don't take the time to have these discussions, then you're likely not going to come out with a strategic plan that really is comprehensive. So the good news is that a big review and update of a management plan, it doesn't have to be done all the time. It's usually every 3 to 5 years. So it's important to set time aside in those intervals to really go through and update a plan and take some time to do it. Okay, so as I mentioned before, part of a good management plan includes some type of a threat assessment. I don't know why the picture is not showing up here, but management planning provides time to deeply explore what human activities threaten the resources you're trying to protect and to look at the root causes of those threats. So if you want to achieve healthy resources, you want healthy corals or seagrass or mangroves, it's critical to look at what human activities are threatening those resources and why those activities are happening. And getting at those root causes helps you identify the actions you can take to really address the threat and be strategic. Okay, that's good. I don't know what happened to that last image. So for example, if we look at this image, we see there are some threats. I know some of you probably recognize this image from the LEAP tool, but we see that there are threats to the environment. So we can see that all of these things, the deep clearing of forests and mangroves, dredging, piggery waste, dynamite fishing, all of these things can threaten mangroves, seagrass beds, and reefs by direct damage or causing dirt to smother or nutrients to create algae blooms. What we can't see in this image is the root cause of the threat. Why are people clearing mangroves and forests? Or why are people using dynamite fishing? So a threat assessment is an organized process that helps you look at why these things are happening. So let's look at an example in this picture. We can see that there's nutrients from piggery waste that's running into the ocean. And could be caused by pig farmers who don't know how to dispose of waste safely, or they don't have any alternative to disposing waste. And they need to raise pigs for income or cultural reasons. So there also might not be rules against dumping waste into streams and into the ocean. So these are some of the root causes of that piggery waste going in. They don't know any other alternative. There's no rules against it, and they need income. So we can't just stop it. So we know that if these are the reasons why, these are the root causes, some of the actions that we can take would be helping farmers learn another way, like using dry litter piggeries, or creating community rules that discourage that practice. So the root causes really help us get at actions that are going to be strategic in addressing that threat. So some management plans will use tools like conceptual modeling to visually show the threats and the root causes. And by developing a model like this, we can also trace what we expect to happen when we take a certain action. So how we expect that action will help us achieve and protect the resource. In other words, we're putting down how we think specific actions will lead to certain results. So it's kind of like mapping out our thought process. If we educate pig farmers with new methods and we create rules against dumping waste, we can expect that there will be less nutrients that is going into the marine environment. It's kind of creating that map of how we think things are going to happen. And then over time, as we implement actions, we can go back to the models and review them and determine, were we correct in assuming that these changes would happen based on the actions we took? So in your homework this week, you're going to review any existing threat assessment or conceptual model that you have in your plan and see if it's still relevant or if it needs to be changed. If you don't have a conceptual model or a threat assessment from your previous plan, it's important to do some kind of threat assessment. So for those of you who don't have one, you're going to complete a simplified threat assessment so you have a clear understanding of the threats and root causes at your site. So here are a couple examples on, the homework talks about how you're going to do these threat assessments. But really what you're going to do is look at what are your target resources that you're trying to protect. So in this example, we're looking at coral reefs on the left. A threat might be illegal dredging. So we'd say, why is illegal dredging happening? One reason might be because there's a lack of enforcement. And why is there a lack of enforcement? Because there's a lack of political will. So if we know that there's a lack of enforcement, a lack of political will, some of the actions, this is a tough one to address, but it might be trying to either work with the enforcement agency to improve enforcement, or maybe have volunteer surveillance out there that partners with enforcement, and then trying to influence decision makers to improve enforcement. There also might be a need for dredge to fill roads, and that could be a reason why illegal dredging is happening, and that there's a lack of alternatives. And then this is also, it's challenging, but understanding that these are root causes can help you see where you might play a part in helping to address these issues. Because sometimes you'll just be spinning your wheels if you're not addressing the root cause. You're just kind of trying something, but you're not getting at the real reason of why it's happening. So you'll be doing a simplified threat assessment, or you'll review the one you have in your management plan for your homework this week. The next section that we talk about, and this is the part of the meat of the plan, is your goals, objectives, actions, and measures of success. So developing these are some of the most important parts of the planning, and they also can be some of the hardest, just getting used to how to think about what's a goal, what's an objective, what's an action. And to make it more challenging, different people or different groups have different definitions for these things. So I know that this can be challenging, and so I'm going to review what I think is the easiest way to think about these components. But if you have different terminology for things, or you have, what you consider a goal or objective is different, then that's okay. We'll just kind of talk about what are the important pieces of it. So first, let's talk about what goals and objectives are. So goals are broad statements on what we're trying to achieve overall. They're more long-term and look at the ultimate results we're trying to achieve. So we've talked about this in that, theory of change that we looked at earlier of all the different columns of management effectiveness. We're all the way over on the right. It's this conservation or socioeconomic outcomes. What are you really trying to achieve at this site? It's tied to the purpose of the site. It's what the community wants to get out of the site. And they should be relatively easy for the public to understand. You usually only have like 1 to 3 goals in a plan. That's, generally. So an example is maintaining or improving coral reef ecosystems, increasing food fish populations, maintaining cultural practices. They're broad statements, but they give us an understanding of the direction that the community wants to go with the site. They want to increase food fish populations. And that's an outcome that they want to achieve. It's not like they want to train staff. Like, that's great. You want to do that, but you want to train staff so that they can manage things. So ultimately you get improved fish populations or healthy coral reef ecosystems or community benefits. So think of goals as those like ultimate things you're trying to achieve. Then we get into objectives, and these are practical statements of what you're going to achieve during the span of your plan. It's like 3 to 5 years. What are you going to do and achieve that's going to help you get to that goal? And objectives should be SMART, meaning they should be specific. So you want to be kind of detailed about what you're trying to do, not general. Measurable, you want to be able to know if you're succeeded in this by having some measure in there. Achievement oriented, again, this is meaning you accomplish an objective. It's something that it's a result versus you doing something. They should be realistic. Like sometimes people will say, we're going to eliminate poaching by 100%. And that might not be realistic. It could be for certain sites, but you want to think about, is this realistic, or are we setting ourselves up for failure because we've aimed too high? And they're time bound. They're basically saying within 2 years, we're going to achieve this, or in the next 5 months, we're going to achieve this. So you achieve goals and objectives, meaning they're end results, you've accomplished something. And here are some examples of some not so smart objectives versus smart objectives. So we'll just look at a couple here. So you might say reduce violations. So that's not really specific. It's not very measurable and time oriented, by when, by how much. So maybe a more smart objective could be something like, by November 2025, we established a surveillance platform with 24/7 presence in the site. That's something we know we can measure. We are really clear about what we're trying to achieve by November 2025. And we can say, we've achieved this. We said we were going to do it and we've achieved it. Another one, work with communities to make rules for managed areas. Okay, a more smart objective could be finalize size limits for 3 target fish species by 2025. Again, we can really clearly understand if we have achieved this. We can say, have we identified the 3 target fish species? Have we identified size limits and finalized them, made them into rules, and we know by a certain date? So these are examples, but the main thing is to really be that specific and measurable. So within the time frame of your plan, you have achieved these things. And these are helping you with those broad statements like improve coral reef health or, improve populations of food fish species. Those broader goals are going to be tracked through your biological monitoring or community input and assessments. So that's how they tie together. Okay, so now we have actions. So actions describe the details of how you're going to achieve your objectives. And you'll have multiple actions that add up to achieve one objective. So usually you'll have several actions that you need to achieve an objective. You do actions, so you do the actions, and then you achieve your objectives by doing those actions. And measures of success demonstrate that the project is making progress on the actions you said you would take, and that you're achieving the desired results of your stated goals and objectives. So it's basically answering, how will we know and demonstrate we're making progress in management and achieving our goals? And that's where we're getting, and we'll talk more about monitoring later, monitoring review, but you're going to want to monitor both those long-term trends toward your goals, and have you achieved those objectives that you said? Do you have that surveillance platform out and 24/7 presence? Is that happening? And then you can even track your actions. You know, have we done the things we said we would do to achieve those? So this graphic just shows you how these all line up. So you've got these broad goals on the top. They could be conservation or socioeconomic goals, those broad statements. They're long-term. These are ultimately what you want to achieve. You usually have several objectives underneath those that are going to help to achieve that goal. And then each objective has different actions. These are, what are we going to do? These are really like what your management staff are going to do. And these are like, in 1 to 3 years, we're going to take all these activities and achieve this objective. And then when we combine these objectives, we can help achieve our goal. So another quick example of this is, if our goal is to improve target coral reef food fish populations, an objective in our plan might be, by 2025, we establish size limit rules for rabbitfish outside the site. By 2026, we conduct fisheries and protected area outreach to fishers in the community. And by 2026, we increase enforcement presence with an enforcement platform. So I just built out one of these to show you actions, but in this first example of an objective for establishing size limits, our first action might be, we have to work with a scientist to identify appropriate size. Then we're going to work with neighboring communities to do outreach on the size limits. And then we're going to try and pass the rules to establish size limits in 3 communities. So these are really, you know, kind of quick actions that I wrote down. They might be, you might need more than that, but it just gives you an example of how your actions are the things you have to do to achieve that objective. And these red dots indicate that you can track your progress. Have we worked with scientists and ID'd the appropriate size? Like, check, we know we've done that. We know we're making progress toward this objective. If you write your objectives smart, you've kind of built in your measurement. You know that by 2025, you have to look at, have we established these size limits? And that's your measure right there. You've already figured out how you're going to monitor your progress toward this. And then you have indicators for these goals. And these are, again, usually where the longer term monitoring comes in, or socioeconomic monitoring comes in. So ways you can influence your management plan. One is to review your plan and ensure you have those key components for a good plan. In particular, really looking at your goals and objectives, and are you clear about what you're trying to achieve ultimately, and what you're going to do in this planning process. And what will you achieve? Are they SMART objectives? Are they somehow measurable? You know, they don't have to be perfect, but you want to be able to know if you're achieving what you said you would. And then you want to review and update your threat assessment. You're going to do this for your homework, but that's another way that you can improve a management plan. And then identify if it's possible or appropriate to include other topics that might be emerging. So maybe it's climate or fisheries, or there's a terrestrial component, like Dua mentioned, that the community already went ahead and they started incorporating a terrestrial component with their protected area. So that's another piece that could be helping to improve your management plan. So the next component of effective management during the planning process is using multiple sources of knowledge. So this means using sources including scientific, experiential, local, and traditional knowledge that can be collected either through formal monitoring, desk reviews, engagement sessions, or informal discussions. So plans that use multiple sources are more likely to be comprehensive and strategic. So oftentimes different information sources complement each other and they tell a more complete or full picture that can support management decisions. So for example, scientific information may be able to point to specific threats like overfishing or decline in fish populations, but understanding why that's happening might be better understood through local stakeholder knowledge by helping to clarify things like there's a lack of understanding about the boundaries of the site, or there's a lack of alternative areas for people to fish or alternative livelihoods. So that combination of information can help you figure out what's going on and how you might need to address it. So in this case, you might need to put out boundary markers or support alternative livelihood development opportunities in your plan. So ways that you can influence or improve using multiple sources of knowledge is really just reviewing the sources of information that you're using in the planning process to note if you have a good mix of information type or if it's all from one type. So maybe all of the information is from community engagement and you might want to seek scientific information. Like the PAME team mentioned earlier, Pete Hauk is on the island. He's been supporting the biological monitoring. Sitting down and chatting with him about what's going on in the site is a really great opportunity to get some additional information that can then be complemented by the community engagement sessions. And then you can compare the different sources of information to get that complete information and really see, like, does scientific data support what the community perception is, or maybe there's a difference. Maybe the community perceives the resources are declining, but the science is showing that they're improving or maintaining. And then you have to figure out how to have that conversation to share the different perceptions and science so that people can be on the same page. And this leads us to the next component, which is stakeholder engagement and outreach. And I know this is something that Micronesia Protected Areas sites, you all have historically done a really good job about stakeholder engagement, which is great because how a protected area plan is developed or updated is just as important to its success as what's in the plan. And community engagement really brings stakeholders into the decision-making process planning, which means they then have a sense of ownership of that plan, which is critical. And meaningful engagement also ensures that their values and the desired benefits are reflected in the plan, which helps build trust for and support for the site and site management, and ultimately encourages compliance with the rules. So while it's mostly not the case in Micronesia, there are places in the world where governments have established protected areas that limit access and have little or no engagement of stakeholders. And that's created huge issues in the conservation world because it really breaks down that trust between local communities and populations and conservation. And I know that that's not the case in Micronesia, but it's just kind of emphasizing how important community engagement is. So the planning process designed to listen to stakeholders can also highlight where there's conflicting interests that need to be navigated or resolved. So for example, if you're trying to protect mangroves and there's an interest in having mangroves be conserved from being cleared, that might be challenging where community members need those mangroves for wood for cooking. So balancing the ecological needs for conservation and socioeconomic needs for local livelihoods is not easy, but that genuine discussions and engagement can really help strike the right balance so that you're trying to get the best for both, which is, again, it's not easy, but you can, help, understand why conservation is important, but also really appreciating the need of the community to find, where the right balance is. And that takes good communication skills. It also it's a critical time that you can address expectations of what the site can and cannot achieve, and ensure that communities understand that there's limits of a site to, protected areas can't do everything. And so really making sure that during these community engagement sessions, you're clearly identifying and sharing what the potential of a site, what it can achieve ecologically and not, will help alleviate disappointment or anger if it's not achieving certain things that they thought it was going to achieve. And that also can identify where you might need to do some outreach to understand certain topics that relate to those expectations of what a site can achieve. And we'll talk about that more too around design of the site. So this is an example from Palau. So communities may, for example, express concerns over shoreline erosion in their site and wish to develop a seawall. But a seawall may make erosion worse along nearby shorelines. This is something that happens a lot with seawalls. It makes the problem worse next door. And then you end up having to build seawall and seawall and seawall. So this is an example of a seawall in Palau that was put up to protect a nearby bathroom building on one of the rock islands. And the wall caused more erosion to get worse on a beach that was important for tourism. And so it may have been more effective to move that bathroom away from the shoreline and allow that sand to shift naturally than to try and build the wall, which created more problems. So this is an example of where outreach to decision makers of sharing information of how shoreline processes work and how seawalls can negatively impact shorelines might have helped them look at other alternatives like moving it away instead of moving forward with something that ultimately created more of a problem. And this is a critical point I want to make, and why most of the tools that we develop in the region include an outreach component, because many community members, they haven't been trained in a lot of topics that we talk about. They have an incredible wealth of local and traditional knowledge. So by kind of combining the local knowledge with some of the more scientific or management-oriented information, you can have really wonderful discussions that help communities make informed decisions. And sometimes if we don't bring that information and they don't have a background, especially things like climate change, this is a new threat. So there's not a lot of knowledge about, how to address some of these things. And so it's really important that as managers, that outreach is shared in these engagement sessions, and then you're also bringing in their knowledge to have a complete discussion. Social equity and inclusion is also increasingly becoming an important consideration for effective management. And again, this is not necessarily, what's happening in Micronesia, but places around the world have implemented conservation at the expense of local communities or vulnerable populations or women. And social equity and inclusion ensures that people are treated in a fair and inclusive manner through the development and implementation of conservation activities. And it's really a critical component of management effectiveness. It includes factors like acknowledging and incorporating the rights, culture, and knowledge and values of local groups and all genders, maximizing benefits and minimizing burdens. That was kind of that example of the mangrove conservation versus the need for, firewood, trying to maximize the benefits of conservation and minimizing the burdens to communities. Inclusion in decision-making and governance and management and leadership, and then ensuring conservation benefits nature and people. So while protected areas in Micronesia have mainly been established through community-based planning to ensure that local people are fairly included in decision-making, it's still important to think about and discuss social equity and identify, are there potential areas that could be improved? I know certain sites have, kind of looked at how things are done and realized the inclusion of women has often been overlooked during protected area planning and management, but women are often impacted directly or indirectly by management decisions, and they can also influence compliance and support for management, and therefore if sites are effective. So including women in planning is critical for effectiveness, and it might require looking at power structures and whether women are able to participate in planning in ways that allow them to be open and honest in discussions and provide input. It might have to be a women's group session alone so that they can offer their input. So gender inclusion is really also an important part of global biodiversity and climate and sustainability commitments and targets that many of your countries, or I think all of your countries, have signed on to. So again, it's another important component. And then the final part of stakeholder engagement is around conflict resolution. So we know that different stakeholders have different interests and needs, and those can conflict with each other and management interests. So for example, fishers might feel it's not really fair that we're not allowed to fish at a site while tourists can go in and use the site, especially if they feel that tourism does any type of damage, whether it be anchor damage or overuse. That can create a real conflict. And if that's left unaddressed, it can grow and really undermine the site management and compliance. So defining in a management plan, thinking about how conflicts will be resolved before conflicts arise can be a useful part to include in planning. And those can include traditional methods of conflict resolution. You guys have really strong ways that conflicts have been dealt with traditionally, and it's important to look at those. That might be the best route to think about and include in your planning. So it's never too late to engage stakeholders. Management plan updates provide a great time to bring in stakeholders, re-engage people, even if they weren't engaged in the initial establishment or planning. Updating a plan is a great time to get them back engaged. So identify all stakeholders that should be engaged and think about if there are groups that are typically left out of the discussion and the process, like women or marginalized groups, and how you can bring them into the decision-making process. And then conduct outreach sessions before decisions happen to review topics that are related to decisions. So maybe it's the value of protected area or ecological processes like shoreline erosion or design of protected areas, which we'll talk about in a minute. But make sure that you share a good amount of information if there's an important decision to be made, so that people can really use that kind of information when they're making a decision. And then identify specific ways conflicts will be resolved before they happen. So who has the authority to address conflicts among stakeholder groups? And, what ways can you use to minimize conflicts? Zoning and rural development, which is also sometimes called MPA design. And these are usually described as part of your management plan. Zones are specific areas that allow or don't allow certain activities. For example, no-take zones don't allow taking of any resources, while other zones like seasonal closures might be closed at certain times, like when spawning occurs, to protect a certain species or to protect a reproducing species. Or you might have areas that are closed off to protect certain species, like no sea cucumbers are allowed to be taken. So some protected areas include just one zone, and many in Micronesia are this way. They include one no-take zone, which means that there's nothing allowable to be removed, or no marine organisms. Sometimes there's some subsistence allowed, but there's no damaging of habitat and things like that. Other sites look at bigger areas, like sometimes it's a whole community's waters or a municipality's waters or multiple communities that have come together, and they look at all of their waters combined. And this is also often called a locally managed area. And these larger areas can include different types of zones that allow or don't allow certain activities. But they also include rules that apply to all of the areas between the zones. So if we look at this example in this picture, this community is managing their whole marine area as a locally managed area. And they have one no-take zone in red where there's no taking of any resources. They've got the seasonal closure in green, which is only in certain times of year, which protects grouper spawning when they're spawning. And then there's one yellow zone that's a sea cucumber replenishment zone, to basically say there's no taking of sea cucumbers, but you can do and take other things in this area. And then in the whole area, they have rules that prohibit the clearing of mangroves and prohibit dynamite fishing. So that is not allowed in the whole area. So using more than one zone is really only helpful if you're managing bigger areas, like I mentioned, across communities or whole islands or atolls, and it allows for more variety of management to achieve different goals. And if done well, this approach can allow you to achieve more results because it's capturing a bigger area that captures more species and more habitat. So all protected area zones and rules should be directly linked and driven to the site goals and objectives, or the results, those ultimate results that you're trying to achieve. And zones and rules should also aim to balance the ecological needs with the interests and traditional uses and values of the community. So it's really important that protected areas are designed, again, to achieve the goals that they were set up to achieve. And this is particularly important where there are small protected areas. It's really good to understand if the size and location of the site is able to achieve the results the community is expecting. So let's just look at this picture and this a little bit deeper, because it's really important consideration for Micronesia protected areas. If a community is interested in improving fish populations of certain species, so let's say rabbitfish, unicorn fish, some emperors, and bumphead parrotfish. These fish all move around different size areas. Some of them, like rabbitfish and unicorn fish, are going to require smaller areas. They just live in a smaller area, about 0.6 miles. But emperors and bumpheads can move as far as 6 miles or more. And scientists suggest that protected areas be double the size to protect the species in their range. So emperors and bumpheads that move 6 miles, you'd have to have a protected area be 12 miles to protect that species within its range. So if it's less than 12 miles, then your protected area alone can't improve those fish populations. And if a community is really interested and expecting that their protected area, which is only maybe 2 miles, if that, 2 miles wide, if they're expecting improvements in those bigger emperors and bumpheads, and their site is, there's no way it's capable of doing that, they might be really disappointed when they're not seeing those populations improve. So it's really important to consider what your protected area, based on the size and the location, is able to achieve over extended periods of time, because we run the risk of eroding trust of stakeholders who believe that we're going to achieve certain conservation and socioeconomic interests if the site can't actually do it. And that's, again, where that outreach component comes in. When we talked about the importance of sharing information with communities, like this information, how far do fish move? And can the protected area that they have improve certain populations of species? Maybe they're looking at giant clams and they're looking at some of these smaller parrotfish, and their site can do a really good job of improving those species. That's great that they know that, but they also know that if they want to see emperors and bumpheads improve, they might have to think about stuff in it as supporting management outside of the site. So things like fisheries management, having size limits outside of the site, or working with other communities so that they are in a 12-mile area and doing some rules around taking of those fish or size limits in that area. Those could be municipality level or atoll-wide levels. But how can you think in a bigger area to capture some of these larger ranging species? And not only is the size important, but the location is also important and understanding, what it can achieve. So many species use different habitats during different times of their life. When they're larvae, they're just babies, or juveniles, all the way to adults, they're using different habitats. So to improve populations, they need all of those habitats to be healthy, so that when they're in their life stage, they have that healthy habitat available. If one of those habitats is damaged or not available to them, it could impact all the species that use that habitat at some time in their life cycle. So just among the 3 species in this image, we can see the importance of seagrass, sandy areas, inner reefs, and outer reefs. If any of these habitats is damaged, it could negatively impact all of these species that use that habitat. And it's why it's important that protected areas try to include various types of habitat. If we just protect coral reefs, we might be missing out on the nursery areas of mangroves and seagrass beds that are so important for young juvenile fish. So ways to improve zoning and rural development. One is to review your site objective and your goals against the design of the site, thinking about what is the size of the site, what can we expect to happen here, what kind of habitats do we have in our site, and ensure that the design of the site can achieve the objectives and goals that the community wants to see. And if not, you might have to rethink either the design of the site or manage the expectations of what it can achieve. So be really clear with the community of what it can achieve with that site. And so that gets to conducting outreach to share what's achievable. Where it can't achieve certain objectives, you can also, again, look at ways outside of the site to complement with broader rules and management, like fisheries management. And then ideally, you try and manage the largest area possible through the use of different types and zones. So it's not always about creating the largest areas possible and making it all no take, but managing the largest area possible and using these different types of zones and rules between allows you to capture more fish species, more habitat, and gives you more options for management. Climate change, as we know, is one of the biggest threats to our environment and our communities. And considering climate change in management is key to management effectiveness. So just, I know a lot of you guys know this, but just a brief overview. Throughout the Earth's history, the climate has been changing. It's gotten hotter, it's gotten colder at some times. You've heard of the Ice Age. But these shifts happened over thousands and thousands of years. But over the past 150 years, human activities are causing the Earth to warm up much faster than it would naturally. And those activities are related to burning fossil fuels like powering cars and trains and planes and factory farms. They all cause the release of gases that accumulate in the atmosphere, and they create kind of like a blanket that traps heat, like a car when you roll up the windows and it traps the heat of the sun. And that's causing the Earth to heat up, and that's what we call climate change. And this is having significant impacts to our environment and communities. So climate change will cause higher air temperatures and warmer seas, and that creates more intense storm events when you have warm waters and warm air. That warmer water is expanding, and we've got glaciers melting and the ice caps melting, which is causing sea levels to rise. And the warm waters are also creating more extreme rain events and drought events. And all of these things can really have damage to our communities and place significant stress and threats to our environment. They can degrade habitat, change migration patterns, and cause a loss of food security and livelihoods. So protected areas can't stop climate change, but they can be designed and managed to increase resilience. And what we mean by that is that climate resilience is when your ecosystems or your communities are able to withstand, adjust, and recover from these stresses and disturbances. So in other words, a resilient system is less impacted by climate change than a system that is not resilient. And some of those principles that Liz mentioned in those 9 principles are principles to support resilience. So that was something that was considered there too. So the way protected areas can help build resilience is by keeping healthy resources healthy and communities organized and prepared. So these healthier systems are more resilient to climate change. So just looking at this image, the healthy resources of the community on the left are providing for the livelihood and the health of the community members. They've got healthy forests, clean water that's going out into healthy reefs, mangroves that are protecting their shorelines. So that healthy community is going to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So for example, the community that has like healthy corals, when warmer waters happen and there's coral bleaching, it's more likely that a healthy reef is going to survive and recover than a reef that's already weakened and degraded. And those healthy reefs can also help to protect the communities from shoreline erosion and flooding because they break the wave actions in storm events. So the community on the right is going to be more severely impacted by climate change because their resources are already degraded. So if we look, the upland forest has been cleared. If there's heavy rain events, it can cause landslides more easily than the healthy forest side. And that can cause dirt to smother the reefs and threaten their food sources. And as a result, the recovery from climate hazards and other threats are going to take longer or may not happen. So it's important when we're managing protected areas and planning processes that we consider these impacts and we think about how the ecological and social systems will be impacted and how we can help build the resilience of these systems. So many of the components that we've been reviewing in this course will help you build resilience. And if you manage effectively, protected areas help achieve that, ease the impacts of climate change. And there's certain key resilience principles that can be considered, and that includes reducing local threats. And we talked already about your threat assessment and how that can really help you identify what are those key threats and root causes so you can reduce the threats. Ensuring there's representation, replication, replication, and connectivity of key habitats. So this means that all those habitats that we talked about in the earlier session, how you need those key habitats to protect species at different stages of their life, that they're represented. They're replicated, meaning you have more than one area of, say, mangroves protected. You don't just have one area that's protected of mangroves. You have multiple areas that are protected of mangroves. And that they're connected, meaning that they're close enough to each other that currents are able to move larvae between those areas. So if one area gets damaged, so a coral reef or a mangrove area gets damaged in a big storm event, that another healthier area is close enough to it that it could carry larvae or small like seeds, like pods from mangroves to those other areas that are damaged. And it's also important to think about protecting areas that have demonstrated resilience in the past. So some areas may have bleached in the past and recovered, and it's important to notice where those areas are. And a lot of fishermen know this type of information, where there's been damaged areas and it's recovered. That can indicate that those are more resilient systems and they maybe should be protected. Thinking about climate change, we also need to consider social resilience, which is the resilience of the community, and ensuring that stakeholders are informed about climate impacts and thinking about ways that you can help them adapt to changes. So if they're highly dependent, for example, on fisheries for food and sustenance, what ways can you help prepare them if that resource is to be damaged in the future? Things like that. How do we help communities prepare for these changes? So I know that in many cases, a single protected area is not able to achieve all of these resilience principles, and it really requires a large area. So this is another time to think about, how can we manage things on a bigger area and consider different zoning, so that we can start thinking about capturing the right habitats and multiple replications of the right habitats, and looking at how we can create networks that use all of these principles and work together as networks. So ways to improve climate change resilience and planning, conducting a vulnerability assessment to explore how the protected area and the local community will be impacted by climate change, looking at what other protected areas or management outside of your site how you can work together to help build resilience. That's kind of looking at that network level of protected areas or broader schemes of zoning and rural development. And then identifying ways to help communities build resilience and really thinking about the impacts to local communities. And I know that so much work that's been done in Micronesia has been really great around climate change. So I think actually Micronesia is a leader in community work on climate change. Okay, so the final component we're going to talk about today is monitoring and review periods. So during plan updates, it's really important to identify how you're going to measure progress toward your goals and objectives, as well as when you're going to do a review and update of your plan. So we talked about this already a little bit, but basically, we really want to make sure that your monitoring is clearly linked to your goals and objectives. You don't want to just be monitoring things randomly that aren't giving you the information that you need and that will help you understand your progress. So thinking about how any biological or socioeconomic monitoring or even community discussions are helping to give you information about progress toward your ultimate goals or your objectives. So you want to describe in your methods, that what you're going to monitor and how you're going to track progress. And then monitoring methods can take many forms and depending on the capacity and resources. So it's okay if you don't have formal scientific monitoring data that can be collected. You can still understand changes over time and, changes to the natural environment and resource conditions through socioeconomic or community discussions and perceptions. So, it really depends on what your capacity is, but it shouldn't mean if you don't have capacity that you sort of forget about monitoring. You can still use those community discussions with key stakeholders to say, what's happening in the water? What's happening with the food fish that are important to you? Are you seeing more? Are you seeing less? What's the health of the mangrove system like? You can use those discussions to get an understanding of trends in the resources. And that can often be really, really helpful in monitoring. And then assessments of ultimate outcomes can be done like every 3 to 5 years. So you don't have to be, doing these formal assessments all the time, but you really want to look at those trends in resources or trends in community benefits or perceptions of communities every 3 to 5 years. And that's also when you would do a PAME assessment, like the one we're doing here, that can give you that broad look of how you're doing with management overall and what might need to be adjusted. And then you want to also identify those more shorter term review periods. Just when are you going to look at your work plan and assess progress on your work plan? And are there even smaller periods that you want to do an assessment and address emerging issues? So ways you can influence and improve monitoring and review: develop a simple monitoring plan that goes into the management plan, and it just identifies, what data are you going to collect to help you understand progress and success? When are you going to collect that data? How are you going to collect that data? As mentioned earlier, even if intense field assessments are not possible, you can identify when you're going to do community engagement methods to help you understand that information. And then look for partnerships. Are there NGOs or government agencies that can help support monitoring programs of the site? And set clear times each year that you're going to work with your core team to review just what's working toward your plan actions that you said you were going to do. You know, maybe you thought you were going to be able to do something, but it's really not working and you have to shift, you have to readjust. So this is a good time to write out, when are you going to have those smaller meetings to identify those things?